All right, hello, welcome. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for the Antibiotic Reduction Expert Series. My name is Ryan Hines. I'll be the moderator of today's session. I'm the Communications Manager here at Biomin. Today our topic is antibiotic reduction experiences in the UK poultry industry, and I'm joined by our featured speaker, Daniel Parker, Senior Veterinarian in Slate Hall Veterinary Practice. Hi there, Daniel.
Hi, Ryan.
Glad you could join us today.
Thank you very much for you and the Biomin team inviting me to present today. As you said, I'm the Senior Veterinarian at Slate Hall Veterinary Practice. Our practice looks after a number of poultry integrated businesses. One of our main focuses is on broiler production. And in addition to that, I'm the veterinary advisor for the British Poultry Council, which is the federation of poultry meat producers in the UK. What I want to talk to you about today is our antibiotic reduction experiences in the UK poultry industry. The agenda for me is I want to talk a little bit about the background and achievements of the UK poultry meat industry, some practical approaches to reducing antibiotic usage that we've used within our business, and I know that other veterinary practices have used across their client base. Some current issues that we're facing, and then some short conclusions and challenges, and then hopefully we'll have an opportunity for some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. And just on that point, right before you jump in, this is an interactive session, so for everyone listening live right now, you can use the chat function in the tool here to enter your questions for Daniel, and we'll see if we can get to some of those in the Q&A. We'll do as many as we can, time permitting. And it means that also later we're going to come to you and we'll have some questions for the audience where you'll be able to participate. All right? Thank you so much. Please, Daniel, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. Okay, so often when we talk about antibiotic reduction, we actually, what we're really talking about is antibiotic stewardship. And the British Poultry Council decided, after quite a lot of discussion, to establish an antibiotic stewardship group across its membership. And this was established back in 2011. And a number of contributing reasons for us establishing that antibiotic stewardship group. First was the growing awareness of antimicrobial resistance across both human and animal medicine. And there were some concerns that animal use of antibiotics in animals was contributing to development of antibiotic resistance in humans. Certainly, there was some evidence that there was fluoroquine resistance in Campylobacter and also Salmonella, which of course are both important foodborne pathogens for humans. There were growing reports across, particularly Europe, about the development of extended spectrum beta-lactamase organisms, particularly in E. coli, but also in Salmonella. And again, these have been linked to the use of antibiotics in food producing animals. The government in the Netherlands had already taken some action in terms of imposing restrictions on the use of antibiotics, and these were actually imposed on the industry. And we felt that if we could develop a stewardship group, we could avoid an implementation of bans or targets in terms of reducing antibiotics, and actually demonstrate that we could manage this antibiotic reduction ourselves as an industry. And as always, in quite a lot of Western European countries, there was a lot of targeting, particularly from our media and also by some NGOs, in terms of the overuse of antibiotics in our industry. One of the areas that we were weak on is we did not have good data on our actual usage of antibiotics. There was data available to government that showed what the sales of antibiotics were, but some of those antibiotics had dual licenses, which meant that no one really knew where those antibiotics were used, whether they were used in poultry, in pigs, in cattle, etc. And so we decided that it was important that we developed a data bank of usage and we asked our members to provide us with data in terms of the usage of antibiotics within their businesses, which we would then collate anonymously. So again, there was no finger pointing in this. It was collected anonymously, and then it would be fed back to the membership companies, and they'd be able to understand perhaps where they stood in terms of antibiotic use versus other producers. So what this graph shows the total sales of antibiotics for all species. This is data that comes from the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, our government organisation responsible for antibiotic licensing and for antibiotic sales, data collection in the United Kingdom. And if we look, the dark blue bar shows the total sales of antibiotics for all animal species. So this includes both food animals, pets and horses. The red bar highlights the products that are licensed for use in food producing animals only. And as you can see from this data, clearly there is the major contributor of antibiotic use across all species is use in those products used for food producing animals. However, we need to put this into context. Clearly there are a lot more animals in the UK that are kept for food production purposes compared to those that are kept as pets. But clearly there's that's the major contributor. Now the light blue bar gives the data of that the British Poultry Council pulled together of their usage data in their membership. So this is antibiotic usage of antibiotics that was going into meat poultry over the years. And you can see that back in 2012, there was somewhere in the region of around about 80 tons of antibiotics that went into food producing animals. It increased in 2013, and that was actually largely responsible to a very poor harvest year. We had some very poor quality raw materials going into due to the wet harvest, and that contributed to that increase in usage in 2013. And then in subsequent years, we have seen a steady reduction in the antibiotic usage by British Poultry Council members, and these members account for around about 90% of the poultry, meat poultry that's produced in the UK. When we convert these figures into population correction unit figures, which is a figure that's been developed by the European Union to assess the amount of antibiotics that's used in a particular species, and a population correction unit is almost a way of being able to compare usage across different species. It's not entirely a correct method, but nevertheless it's quite a useful figure that could be used for some level of comparison. And again, what this bar graph shows you is the milligrams per PCU for chicken producers in the UK. This is extracted really from the British Poultry Council figures. And as you can see, again, back in 2014, we were using somewhere in the region of 48 milligrams per PCU, and steadily over the years, we have reduced that down to a low in 2017 of 9.85. It rose again in 2018, and I think we were not unsurprised by that. Perhaps that little bit of a bounce at the bottom, and we're expecting those figures to steady at around about that sort of figure going forward. For turkeys, the figures show higher usage initially and higher usage even now in 2018. And this is in part, I think, because of the longer lived life of a turkey compared to compared to a broiler chicken, but also some of the challenges in turkeys are greater than we see in broiler production. So when we look at the summary of what's been achieved by the British Poultry Council members over the last 6 years, 2012 to 2018, there's been an around about an 80% reduction in the total use of antibiotics. There's also been an 82.6% reduction in the use of what are called the highly critically important antibiotics for humans. So that's fluoroquinolones, cephalosporins have been effectively eliminated. So has colistin. But these are the other antibiotic class that was included in that, based on WHO views, was also macrolides. So a very significant reduction, and having said that, that was already from a low point anyway, but reduced the levels, the usage of those particular antibiotics considerably. So again, it's a good success story, and what this really illustrates is about companies working together in a non-competitive arena to look to benchmark usage. And actually, I think this also demonstrates the fact that you can leave an industry to get on and do something by itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be achieved by introducing legislation, because the sort of reductions we've seen in the United Kingdom are equally as good as what has been seen in some parts of continental Europe, where they've actually imposed levels of antibiotics that can be used. But antibiotic stewardship is not just about antibiotic reduction. We don't want to get to a no antibiotics ever situation that perhaps has arisen in the United States and other parts of the world. We need to have medicines to ensure we can maintain the health and welfare of our poultry. To me, that's really important. I don't want to see a situation where, as a veterinarian, I have to say I'm not going to treat those animals because I'm concerned about putting antibiotics in them, because we have a marketing stance that is that we're not going to use antibiotics. That is not, in my view, sustainable, and also I don't think it's an ethical approach. However, what we need to try and achieve with antibiotic stewardship is actually to try and reduce antibiotic resistance, to preserve the limited armory of antibiotics we have available. Now, there's much debate about whether what is the responsibility of the use of antibiotics in animal production on the impact of antibiotic resistance in humans, because ultimately that's really what this debate is about. It's about antibiotic resistance in humans and ensuring that those antibiotics are available to treat bacterial diseases in humans. But it's to me, it's important that we still ensure that we have access to antibiotics to be able to treat sick birds.
Great. So thank you for framing that. Certainly some remarkable progress made by the BPC and the UK poultry industry there in terms of the reduction of the usage of antibiotics over a number of years. So you framed antibiotic stewardship as both the need to reduce the incidence of antimicrobial resistance, but also the need to protect these treatment tools to ensure that they're there so they continue to be used when they are needed.
Absolutely. I think it's about using antibiotics responsibly so that we manage and hopefully reduce the development of antibiotic resistance, both in the pathogens that potentially will affect our poultry, but also in foodborne pathogens as well.
All right. Let's take a moment right now to ask our first audience poll question. So we're going to take this idea of antibiotic stewardship that you've outlined, and we're going to ask them the following question. So do you consider antibiotic stewardship in your operation? Now we have a lot of different businesses and job roles represented here, but please take a moment to choose whether some of the ideas that Daniel has just outlined here are something that you've considered or are reflected in the way that you conduct business. And as those answers come in, we're going to allow for just a moment for everyone to choose the single best answer, yes, no, or not sure. And I see that we've had roughly half of our attendees already vote, which is great. And as soon as we get those answers in, we're going to go ahead and close the voting in just a second and share those out with you so everyone can see, again, a bit of a reflection of the benchmarking that you mentioned earlier, Daniel. We'll have a look at how everyone compares. So we will now close the voting with 2/3 of our audience having the chance to answer, and then I'm going to share those results right here on screen with you now. So here's what you had to say. It's an overwhelming yes, right? So nearly 75% of everyone listening right now to our live session considers antibiotic stewardship in their business. 12% said no, and there were some who were not yet sure about that. Now we have a diverse audience from many parts of the globe. Is there anything in there that surprises you or stands out?
No, I think I'm pleased because I think as an industry, we're a major food producer. We need to be mindful of the fact that antibiotics usage in our animals has the potential to develop antibiotic resistance. And I say potential. I still don't believe that it's a major driver of antimicrobial resistance in humans, but it is a driver. And I think it's important as an international industry that we show leadership in this area. We're an easy target, and if we can show leadership, then I think that is a real positive for our sector.
Absolutely. All right. Well, please carry on with your remarks, Daniel.
Okay, so carriage, this particular graph actually shows some work that we again have done within the British poultry industry and is also undertaken by our government. And this shows actually the carriage of antibiotic resistance, so-called ESBLs, extended spectrum beta lactamase organisms, and AMP-C resistant organism, resistance in E. coli. And the survey has been undertaken in 2016 and 2018, and actually at a similar time frame, retail chicken was collected on a randomized basis across the UK, and they looked at that for ESBL E. coli carriage. And I think what's again really interesting with this data is it shows that over the time period when we've actually introduced our antibiotic stewardship scheme across the bulk of the UK poultry industry, we've actually seen a significant reduction in ESBL carriage, both in chicken CICI. These samples are taken at slaughter, and also in the retail chicken. So actually, there has been a reduction in those potential antibiotic-resistant genes being carried on in chickens and also on retail chicken meat. And that to me is a real positive. We can't say for sure that it's related to the antibiotic reduction across the industry, but common things occur commonly, so it's probably the most likely reason why we've seen that reduction, which I think is a real positive, again, demonstrating that antimicrobial stewardship can yield real important steps in terms of reduction in antimicrobial resistance. So what are the challenges to reducing antibiotic usage? And really, I would put these down as the main reasons. Okay, first, we need to have healthy stock. The only reason we should be treating with antibiotics is if the stock are not healthy. And to get healthy stock, it's really easy. You just have to have a viable chick. You've got to have a good environment. You've got to have quality feed. You need to be disease-free, so you need to have good biosecurity, and you've got to have good hygiene. And it's as easy as that. Unfortunately, in practice, it's often not as easy to achieve as to put down on paper or put in some presentation headings. So we all have challenges, but ultimately that's what we need to have healthy stock. Now, looking at some of the changes that have occurred across the UK poultry sector over recent years, probably one of the biggest changes that has happened in our industry is environmental investment. And this, of course, is looking to reduce the use of fossil fuels. And the UK government introduced a green energy initiative in what they called renewable heat incentives, where they encourage people to use renewable heat sources rather than fossil fuels. And this particular photograph shows what we would call biomass heating, which is an indirect form of heating where hot air is introduced into the house rather than having gas or oil burners in the house, which actually not only produce heat but also introduce CO2 and water into the house. Now, the big advantage of this for us is that it reduced moisture in the house, and that's probably the biggest challenge to any broiler producer, is actually eliminating water from the house. Water that is introduced through the gas burners, water that's introduced through the chickens. That's probably the biggest challenge. And again, for us on where birds are reared on floor, this is slightly different. If you're in countries where they're reared in cages or they're reared on wire, this has enabled us to have better litter quality. It's helped us to reduce our coccidiosis challenges, and it's led to better overall intestinal health. And that's had a massive impact in terms of the health of our birds and requirements to use antibiotics. The second area we've focused on is better cleaning, and particularly cleaning of drinker lines. Drinker lines have the capacity to develop biofilm, and within biofilm there is often persistence of organisms which can lead to poor bird health. And this particular piece of kit is a cleaning system that introduces air and also pulses air and also water. And what that does is it helps dislodge biofilm that becomes attached in the drinker lines. And if you look at those two buckets down at the bottom there, the one on the left-hand side is water that has come out of a line that's had this system used on it. And you can see the amount of rubbish that's actually been removed from that line. And then afterwards, we've got good, clean water. Clean water is an absolute must in terms of getting good poultry production. And this illustrates the sort of material that becomes dislodged when you use a piece of kit like this. You can do this with chemical cleaners, but the physical agitation that arises related to this use of this piece of kit really dislodges the biofilm material. And again, the tubes on the tubes on the side show the variation. We've got a couple in there where we've got some really heavy levels of biofilm, the third and the fifth tube along. You can see that level of biofilm in there is absolutely horrendous. Now that's not going to be good for your poultry. So cleaning drinker lines is really important. And again, when we've looked at assessing this after cleaning, just to illustrate, if we look down here at waterline 3 in shed 4, we look at the levels of TBCs and E. coli, okay, and Pseudomonas before we actually flushed. So this was a sample taken out of the line before we actually flushed it. During the flush, we saw high levels of TVCs, and after the flush, we got the levels right down. I mean, not at zero in this particular one, but they are significantly lower, and this is going to have a massive impact. And in other cases, we've actually managed to achieve zeros across the board post the flushing. Again, this is a way of assessing how well we've actually cleaned our drink lines. If we looked, I look back through the database, our database from which we have in our clinical database, which we have in our practice back for 2019. So, and looked at the main reasons why we had implemented antibiotic therapy across the broiler production base. And what's quite interesting is that the two main reasons that we've been using antibiotics is related to chick quality and also to leg health. And the leg health may present itself as osteomyelitis or femoral head necrosis, purulent arthritis, chick quality, yolk sac infections, and early septicemia. As you see there, enteric issues accounted for 10% of antibiotic usage across our client base, which I have to say is significantly lower than I would have seen perhaps say 8 or 9 years ago. So when we look at chick quality, the main reasons are that we have had to treat is related to yolk sac infections, early septicemias, often related to pathogens like E. coli or Enterococcus or Pseudomonas. And really the way to tackle this is looking at better quality control of your eggs, your hatching eggs, your incubation, and your day-old chicks. And management is a key factor in terms of improving chick quality. So I'm going to ask a question of the audience, and I'd say ask the question is, what does the audience think is wrong with these chicks?
Let's give them the chance right now. So here's our second audience question. Please select the answer that you think is most likely. Are these chicks too hot, too cold? Is it an issue of a yolk sac infection? Or perhaps you're not sure? And we're going to give everyone just a minute to choose the answer that they think is most appropriate. And now we see that those answers are coming in. We have already half of our audience voting. We're going to give it just another second, and then we're going to read out the results and see, Danielle, if they managed to get it right, because presumably you're going to share with us then the correct answer. All right, with 2/3 of the audience having weighed in, let's see what everyone has to say. Well, looks like yolk sac infection was chosen 41%. Followed by too cold at 29%, too hot 21%, and 9% said that they're not quite sure. How did they do?
Well, I'm afraid they got it wrong. Okay, so although I think 21% of them got it right, those chicks were too hot. All right. Now, when I look at those chicks, I think, well, yeah, maybe they do look too hot because they're actually all grouped together. Hot chicks separate out. Hot chicks hold their wings away from their body. Okay. The reason why these chicks are clumped together is they're just too hot to move. They're just absolutely exhausted. And these chicks had actually had a temperature stress actually during transportation. And that's the temperature that they were that was running at, and it's far too hot. Okay, and this is where I say that management becomes really, really important in terms of being able to identify and manage these issues, because the consequences of this is that often you'll see yolk sac as a consequence of that temperature stress. But actually, what we often see also is later in life issues related to leg health, and this has probably been one of our big challenges, as I say, recently, based on our antibiotic usage, is bacterial infections. They're often non-responsive, poorly responsive to antibiotic therapy. Often we will identify enterococcus from these joint issues, and you can see there is some purulent material in the joint there, but it's not really some kind of thick pus that you often see with Staphylococci. It's slightly different. These will often present in the mid to late teens and result in ongoing culling. And I think the big worry with these is they're often poorly responsive to antibiotic therapy. And again, sorts of things we'll also see with these birds is we'll see pericarditis. All right, this is what appears to be a fairly mild pericarditis, and again, often when you culture these, you will find you don't isolate any bacteria from them, and they're resolving. But these enterococcal infections actually reduces the bird's ability to be able to compete. Often the birds are smaller. Maybe they say they're debilitated with also joint infections. And the other thing you often see with these is this spinal lesions, where we get an osteomyelitis in the vertebral body of the spinal cord, resulting in collapse of that vertebral body and actually impinging on the spinal cord, which causes a level of paralysis. And you open them up and you can see all of the reaction, the osteomyelitis, the birds trying to react and trying to manage it by putting down cartilage to try and stabilize this vertebral joint. But the consequences are that the birds often have this dog sit position in the house. And these birds basically will have to be culled and removed, and they're unable to compete in the broiler environment. So one of the things we need to consider here is the intestine as a barrier. The intestine is a barrier to the external environment for the bird. Obviously, it's very important from the point of view of digestion, and the barrier has multiple layers. We've got the microbiota, and we're going to talk about microbiota as we go forward in this presentation. We've got a mucus. We've got the mucus that's produced by the goblet cells in the intestinal linings. Then we've got the intestinal cells themselves, and then we have stromal cells, and we have immune cells as well, which will provide protection and a barrier to the outside world for the birds. So how can heat have an influence over this barrier, and also in terms of enterococcus? Now, normally in these intestinal cells, we have what we call tight junctions between the cells, which reduce the penetration of bacteria and other pathogens through the intestinal cell lining and into the bird's body. But one of the things we know is from literature is that temperature has been demonstrated to cause changes in gene expression in enterococcus, making it more pathogenic. So that is something that could potentially happen by having higher temperatures. But also we know that heat impacts on those tightness of those tight junctions. And so when you get heat, those tight junctions open up more, and we actually have the potential for more penetration of bacterial and enterococcus through them. Looking at other enteric issues, coccidiosis still remains probably the major precursor of enteric damage in poultry. In part, this is because coccidiosis is a constant challenge. Doesn't matter what part of the world you're in, wherever you have chickens, you'll have coccidiosis. We need to make sure that we've got robust control programs in place to manage that challenge, because that parasitic challenge is going to happen. It's a question of not eliminating it, but managing it, because it is going to happen in all poultry unless you've got them in SPF conditions. So the control programs we need to put in place is we need to have a good hygiene program that's going to remove the coccidial oocysts that are very persistent and can survive in the houses. We need to make sure that we have good litter management if we have birds on the floor, to manage again the replication and maturation of those coccidial oocysts. And in my view, you also need to have a robust coccidiostat control program. Obviously, vaccination is another option, and it's a question of choosing the right program for your individual production area. So I think coccidiosis is really important condition of poultry. Many people have used this illustration that the clinical coccidiosis with mortality, blood and feces is like the tip of the iceberg, right? It's the little bit that sticks above the water, whereas the main impact on bird production is the subclinical coccidiosis, which is the reduced weight gain, less performance, increased feed conversion ratio. And of course, remember that coccidiosis replication is going to cause damage to the enteric lining and potentially allow other pathogens to enter into the birds, notwithstanding the fact that the coccidiosis damage is also going to reduce the efficiency of that gut in terms of digestion and absorption of the food that we feed the birds. And this study by Waldenstedt in Sweden in 2005 looked at a summary of the costs of coccidiosis in the Swedish broiler production in terms of euros. And I think the key thing here is to look at what the cost was of subclinical coccidiosis. All right, significantly, 70% of the cost of coccidiosis is related to subclinical rather than necessarily clinical symptoms. And I think that's an important message to take on. We need to manage coccidiosis to prevent overall losses in our production, and also as a predisposer to use of antibiotics to combat enteric issues. So I go back to the intestinal as a barrier. It's pretty important, in my view, to have good intestinal integrity. Many pathogens access the bird through the intestine. And the other area to think about here is what we call the microbiota. So that's that population of bacteria and other microorganisms that actually live in the intestine. And a huge amount of money is going into research trying to understand the microbiome in all species of livestock, and in fact in humans. The management of the microbiome is actually now being used for clinical management of certain diseases in humans. So it's really important to try and understand. I think for many years we didn't understand the microbiome at all, and injudicious use of antibiotics can have an impact on the microbiome. So we need to be looking after that microbiome as well as the birds. I think there's a better understanding in terms of microbiome diversity nowadays, with better techniques, molecular biological techniques such as 16S ribosomal subunit sequencing and shotgun metagenomics. These are all areas of science that I don't really understand, but clearly it's giving us a better understanding of the diversity of the microbiome. And we can start to, or scientists can start looking at the microbiome for biomarkers of better health and productivity, and also study the impact of microbiome modifiers with these techniques, which is really important. And this is a snapshot of a piece of work that I was involved in, looking at the diversity of microbiota in age in turkeys. And actually what we did with these birds is that we actually assessed these birds through their life, and looked at the phylum level of different bacterial species. And we can see, you don't need to look at the detail, but you can see that these the phylum level, there's a change in relative abundance as the birds get older. And when you get down to genus level, again, you can see a great deal of diversity as the birds age. So particularly they become more diverse as the bird age, which is important. This can be influenced by diet composition as well, but this is a natural development, and this actually happens in all species, and a question of managing that diversity to get the best out of intestinal integrity. So while there are some options for helping us to manage and improve intestinal integrity, well, yes, I think there are. There are various alternative treatments and supplements to be given. So a couple I want to talk about is competitive exclusion, probiotics, there's prebiotics, there's essential oils and organic acids, and I don't have time to go into to all of these today, but there are lots of scientific papers out there demonstrating the benefit of certain of these types of products. But I just want to share with you some of the again some of the data from our business in terms of what we have seen. So competitive exclusion is the use of products that are undefined. Okay, so these are undefined products in terms of the bacterial and the bacterial nature of them. And the two main products that are available are actually derivatives of or harvested from healthy adult birds, and these are replicated and then used as supplements. And competitive exclusion was developed first by Nurmi, who's a Scandinavian scientist, and he developed the idea that competitive exclusion enabled, by using competitive exclusion, you could competitively exclude some pathogens from the intestine of birds. And we know that in laboratory studies, competitive exclusion products have been used to exclude Salmonella species in poultry. And again, this graph shows you again where we introduced competitive exclusion into a broiler operation, and actually over a period of time we saw a reduction in the level of Salmonella that we isolated from the broilers. Now, you know, this is I'm not saying this is entirely due to competitive exclusion, but certainly competitive exclusion had a role to play in it. And there was anecdotally some evidence that also it reduced the incidence of bacterial leg infections. But actually, we've also got some data which actually shows where competitive exclusion has been introduced, and this is looking at the level of rejects processing related to cellulitis and also to bacterial infections. And I think really what I'd like to draw your attention to is this is the sort of level that we were running at in terms of rejects. We introduced competitive exclusion, and we've seen a significant drop in terms of the level of those rejects, and this is weeks of the year. So again, some real positives by using competitive exclusion in this particular situation. Probiotics. Probiotics again, I think have real value, and this is some data I just want to share with you. Again, looking at the use of probiotics in breeder flocks. So what we were looking to try and do here is look to see whether we could impact on 7-day mortality in broiler chicks following the use of probiotics. And this particular probiotic was given to the birds, and we have flock A, B, and D, and they had a program of probiotic supplementation, and flock C was the untreated flock. And what we also have here is the data in terms of 7-day mortality for the chicks from those the progeny of those flocks in 2018 versus 2019. And I think again, this is not a scientific study. This is a field study. So we have to be mindful that we couldn't control everything. But what is quite interesting with this data is we see that we were running with sort of 7-day mortalities in the region of just under 2% in 2018 in 3 of those flocks. We introduced the probiotic programs, and in 2019, the progeny, the 7-day mortality of the progeny was reduced. Okay, I'm not going to put a level of significance on that because we haven't done the statistics on it. So we had an improved livability in the progeny, and this was without antibiotic supplementation. So any situation where we used antibiotics, we removed those from the data. And if we apply these figures to increase chick numbers based on a 40,000 breeder flock having 140 chicks per hen, right, which is an average number of chicks per hen, we can see that we have increased our chick numbers quite significantly, which more than paid for the probiotic supplementation. So again, areas where we can actually improve the health of the birds.
It's certainly nice to see that example. So thanks for sharing those results. Let's do a quick check with our audience to see their familiarity and use of probiotics in this case. So we're going to do our third and final audience poll question right up here to ask you, do you apply or recommend probiotics in your operation? Yes, no, or not sure. And we're going to let those votes come in, and everyone is very quick this time. We've already had over half of the audience vote, so we're going to give it just another second, and then we will see the results there. Okay, thank you all to everyone who has weighed in. We're going to close our response. And with 3/4 of everyone voting, we see that probiotics are quite popular with this group already, which is great to see. At 90% say yes, 6% no, and 4% not sure.
Okay, that's good news. I mean, it would be interesting to know from the audience whether they, what sort of level of benefit they see with them. But it's good to hear that that other people are using these products as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, so just to draw some conclusions, I think looking at antibiotic use in the poultry industry, I mean, historically, we have used a lot of antibiotics in our production systems. We've used them, and some still do, for antibiotic growth promoters, although that worldwide is now significantly reducing. We've used them for therapy when birds have been unhealthy, and again, we need to challenge ourselves in are there other ways we can improve the health of our birds without using antibiotics. And of course, one of the other areas where we are perhaps targeted, particularly by media and NGOs, is that we mass medicate. So when we medicate a shed of birds, maybe 20% of them are sick, but 80% of them are healthy. But we're treating them because we want to treat the sick birds. We need to get a handle in terms of reducing the antibiotics. We need to ensure we've got quality control through throughout the supply chain into our production systems to make sure that we have healthy stock. And that's looking at breeder health, hatching egg quality. We need to make sure we have good chick quality, looking at incubation and transportation. We need to be ensuring that we've got quality in terms of our feed to ensure we support the microbiome. And we need hygiene and biosecurity to minimize the introduction of pathogens into our poultry. And for me, some of the key areas for antibiotic reduction is managing that intestinal integrity, and that's looking at coccidiosis control, and also looking at that, thinking about that intestinal barrier. And an important part of that intestinal barrier is that microbiome. I think we need to understand more about microbiome management, but there are some real opportunities out there for us to utilize products which we know have some benefit, and as the science becomes available, this will be more widely known of competitive exclusion, probiotics, prebiotics. There are organic acids, and there are also some phytotherapeutics as well that we should be considering. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me, and I think we've probably got some time for some questions. Right.
Absolutely. So we're going to use the remainder of our session here to field questions from the audience. Now, we've had several dozen already submitted, so we're not going to get to all of them, but let's start out with one of the points you mentioned there. You highlighted coccidiosis as something that certainly needs to be managed carefully in order to reduce the need for antibiotic application. The question here relates to spotting the problem, right? So is OPG, in your opinion, the best choice to diagnose a cocci problem in the field?
I think OPGs is one of the tools I would use, but I don't think it's necessarily the best. I think it's a question of looking also at macroscopic assessment in terms of intestinal lesion scoring, coupled with OPGs. The big problem with OPGs is that you can get very significant uplifts in OPGs depending upon the species of bacteria, and species of coccidia. And I think also, if you're going to use OPGs, it's quite important that you use it alongside coccidial oocyst differentiation, and that's not such an easy technique as raw OPG counts.
Okay, good to note. This is an interesting question here. Mentioned that most antibiotics are replaced or reduced. This is typically linked to gut and intestinal issues in poultry. What about when it comes to respiratory system, right? So what about mycoplasmosis, for example? Okay, well,
I mean, I have to say that we're probably in a fairly luxurious position in the UK where mycoplasmosis is actually not a widespread problem. It generally is pretty well managed, and that perhaps puts us in more of a better position. For sure, antibiotics are really useful in helping to manage mycoplasma. I think the question I'd ask is how else can you manage mycoplasma? So there are vaccines available for certain mycoplasma species, and so are you utilizing those? How are you managing your hygiene and your biosecurity? Because mycoplasma don't just appear out of anywhere. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that it's always easy to manage biosecurity in terms of potential, wind-borne carriage, but often these mycoplasma are actually carried into sheds and not necessarily blown into sheds. So I think it's a question of looking at the whole mycoplasma management as a whole, and rather than just perhaps, dare I say it, continuing to use antibiotics to manage the problem.
Okay, and on the flip side of that, going back to the gut issues, what about E. coli? What tools are there in terms of control and prevention that you've seen as effective?
Okay, well, E. coli is complex because we're not talking about a single organism. There are multiple different organisms, different strains of E. coli, and of course their impact and their prevalence is going to vary across different operations. Look, there are some vaccines available for E. coli. I think the key thing to really understand is where is the most probable route of introduction to E. coli into your business? All right, so is it coming through the egg? Is it coming through poor hygiene within the sheds? Is there a precursor that's allowing it in? For example, in terms of from a respiratory perspective, is there a vaccine that you're using which is damaging the respiratory tract, allowing the E. coli to come in, or is it actually coming in through the gut? So then it's quite complex, but there are tools out there in terms of there are tools out there that can be used to help manage E. coli, and it's a question of looking and assessing and implementing those tools to your individual farm or integration.
All right. We have another challenge-specific problem relating still on the gut track, let's say. Can a gut health problem early on, let's say the first 2 weeks, predispose chicks to a rickets problem later on? And what could be the causes or factors influencing that to happen?
Okay, so rickets or poor bone mineralization, yes, can be related to enteric issues. What you've got to remember is that you've got to have efficient digestion and absorption to ensure that the bird gets the correct minerals and vitamins from its diet. And if that gut is damaged, then potentially it's not going to work as efficiently as it should do. So if your diets are, hopefully your diets are adequate, but if they are, even if they're adequate, if you have damaged that gut, it may be that bird cannot absorb the nutrients that are available in that diet. So yes, I've seen cases of what we might call malabsorption that have then resulted in rickets in birds later on, or poor bone mineralization, tibial disc chondroplasia. And in those situations, I'm pretty confident that we had early gut damage. Usually in that case, it's been related to viral pathogens, and that has then resulted in bone mineralization.
All right. So what is the one key factor, the one key thing that anyone listening here could take away that they need to do? Is this a silver bullet, a quick solution, the most important thing that can be done to reduce antibiotics?
There is no silver bullet in my view, but I think there are some key points. I think you need to have the data about why you're using antibiotics in the first place. If you don't know what you're using them for, and that's really collecting quality data to really genuinely understand what you're using them for. Once you understand what you're using them for, then you need to look at targeting that particular challenge to your integration or to your farm. And that could be a question of improving your hygiene and biosecurity, because actually what you've got is you've got some disease that's actually affecting the birds which you're having to treat. It could be that you're not managing your coccidiosis, and therefore you're getting gut integrity issues, which then are affecting the bird, maybe resulting in a diarrhea, or it's again a secondary bacterial infection coming in through the gut. So it's to me understanding why you're using them, and then you've got to have a real focus. But there's no simple bullet. But I think also there's a level of mindset as well. Sometimes it's easy to reach for that bottle of antibiotics and treat those animals. And you have to do that, obviously, to protect their health and welfare. But what you need to then analyze is, I've used those antibiotics, why have you used them, and how can I prevent using them next time?
Yep, absolutely. Certainly gives everyone a lot to think about. I want to thank you for those comments. I want to thank you. At this point, we need to close the Q&A. We've had plenty more questions come in, and we will find a way to follow up with everyone who's asked a question to get you the information you're looking for. Daniel, it was excellent to hear from you. I want to thank you for sharing the success of the effort that you've seen in the UK with the BPC, with an industry-led initiative. So thank you for being here today, sharing those insights, main challenges, and putting people on the path in order to hopefully replicating that success in their own businesses, in their own countries.
Good. Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much for everyone who's taken the time to listen to the webinar. Hope you found it useful. And yeah, if there's questions that come through and we can help answer those, then we'd be delighted to assist.
Excellent. I appreciate that. I have just one more request for our audience. Thank you for your participation today, for your engaging questions and attention. Our antibiotic reduction expert series continues on in May through the rest of the summer. So please go ahead and check that out if you're interested. Upcoming sessions are going to include zero zinc, keeping pigs with long tails. We're back on, and those are both in May. We come back to the poultry topic and non-antibiotic strategies for control of necrotic enteritis on June 16th. What you can do once the session closes, there will be a short survey that pops up to ask you about your experience, how you enjoyed today's session, anything we can do to improve it. We use that feedback in order to go ahead and develop this program for you to help you during this time so that you can have a better feeling for these topics and navigate the antibiotic reduction path in your business. So I want to thank you all. Please take a moment to fill that in, and we'll be joining you again next time. Thanks from everyone here at Biomin. Take care.
Bye.